Greetings, this is J.R. Dickey. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. And by the way, don't forget our website, graceandtruth.net. I hope you're having a great day, but if not, hang with me. It's about to get better. Okay, I call this devotion Stormy. Let's get started. In our day, you might say he just couldn't catch a break. He started off as kind of a grumbler, not all that happy about what God had told him to do. Ironically, he came from a small town just a few miles from modern-day Nazareth, which of course is where Jesus grew up. Ironic because Jesus told those who demanded a sign to prove he was a Messiah. It says in Matthew 12, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." But the sign was not his disobedience to God, because unlike Jonah, Jesus was perfectly obedient to the Father. Thus Christ clarified in the next verse, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And as you know, you don't go any deeper than the heart of the earth. But that's where, in his rebellion, Jonah was headed. God told him in Jonah chapter 1, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it, to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, down and down again. But he didn't stop there. While on the ship, a storm arose. And it says, "But Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had laid down and was fast asleep. And his journey continued, for the men of the ship, fearing for their lives, eventually found out that Jonah was to blame because he was being rebellious to Almighty God." So it says, so they picked up Jonah and threw him, where? Down into the sea. And the sea ceased from its raging. Now, Jonah may have thought, how much worse can this get? And God answered. Jonah chapter 1:17. "Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was down in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Yep, his rebellion made him downwardly mobile, which again is ironic, for in contrast, Christ's obedience made him the same. And another poetic irony is that Christ also fell asleep on a ship that was being tossed about in a sudden storm. His disciples, like the sailors with Jonah, thought they were going to perish, so they woke Jesus. Mark chapter 4 records, "Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." And this is the reason for this devotion. What is it? The storm. The storm that is happening even now. As we can see with Jonah, who was a godly prophet, rebellion against God leads to personal bitterness, and for the ungodly, destruction and damnation. You see, after being puked up on the beach, he went to the city of Nineveh and proclaimed God's message, and lo and behold, the people repented. As a result, God relented from the disaster he had threatened, but this angered Jonah. And when God asked him if it was right for him to be angry, Jonah 4 records, he said, "It is right for me to be angry, even to death." In other words, you can believe and even know about God's character, but still end up in bitterness of soul, because even as with Jonah and Cain, by the way, all the way back to the beginning, pridefulness and self-will results in angry self-focus. On the other side of the coin, so to speak, obedience and trust lead to life and salvation. As with Jonah, it may not come about immediately, but you may even look like fish vomit for a while. But in doing God's good will, people will listen and can avoid catastrophe. Jonah certainly didn't look like a men's apparel model after 3 days of gastric juices, but he became God's sign, a sign of the times, and people responded to his message. And that's what the storm is, the spiritual weather, if you would. That's blustering right now. It's important to take notice of it. For Jesus lambasted the Pharisees for their blindness. In Matthew 16, we see, and in the morning it will be foul weather today, that is, stormy, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. Of course, you may think, what storm? I don't see any storm. And if so, you may be living so much in the present, which isn't necessarily bad, that you don't see the threatening sky that is what's transpiring over time. Well, what do I mean? Let's talk about a few things. First, the destruction of the nuclear family. The destruction or decline of the traditional nuclear family is most clearly illustrated by the drop in two-parent households, the rise in single-parent homes, and shifting marriage rates. Demographically, the percentage of American children living with both of their married parents, birth parents I should say, has fallen to about 60%, down from roughly 73% in 1960. In 1970, over 2/3 of adults ages 25 to 49 lived with a spouse and at least one child. By 2021, that's 5 years ago, only 37% of adults fit that traditional nuclear model. Today, it's even less. In 1960, about 5% of children were born to unmarried women. Today, that figure is roughly 40%. Okay, I could go on. Let's go to looks at attacks on gender. Nationally, about 2.8 Americans aged 13 and older identify as transgender, while trans adults make up roughly 0.8% of the population. 3.3% of youth aged 13 to 17 identify as transgender. Celebrities now routinely celebrate helping their children change their gender. Well, next, birth rate and marriage decline. U.S. fertility rates, guess what, have fallen by 23% since 2007, hitting an all-time low of just 1.6 births per woman, well below the 2.1 necessary for replacement. It's called the replacement level. Similarly, marriage rates have hit historic lows, with married couples making up just 47% of U.S. households, down from 66%. Well, that was 50 years ago. Next, hatred and mental illness increasing. CDC studies show that in 2023, 40% of U.S. high school students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, a significant rise from 30% in 2013, 10 years earlier. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, nearly a quarter of all U.S. adults, that is 23.4%, experienced a mental illness, any mental illness. A major worldwide study published in 2026 found that nearly 1.2 billion, it's with a B, billion people had mental disorders globally, reflecting a massive 95.5, I'll say that again, a 95.5% increase since 1990, driven largely by anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, the total volume of reported hate incidents increased by more than 20% over the last 5 years. Violence wildly promoted. Extensive research indicates that violence permeates a significant portion of entertainment and media. Before turning 18, the average U.S. child will witness more than 200,000 acts of television violence, including 8,000 murders. Approximately 60% of television shows feature violent acts, while over 90% of video games rated for children of ages 10 and older contain violence. Notably, numerous health organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, have classified repeated exposure to media violence as a significant risk factor for increased real-life aggressive behavior, desensitization to violence, and the cultivation of a mean worldview. Jesus and later Paul spoke of what happens during stormy times. Matthew chapter 10 records, "Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death." And in 2 Timothy 3, we read, "But evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived." But we who believe and trust the Lord do not freak out. We do not hide during the storm. We stand. Ephesians 6 says, "Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Now may the Lord grant you peace in the midst of any storm, and faith to trust Him. Look for our next podcast, and may you realize more of His grace today.